So why do developers love GraphQL so much? I fell in love with GraphQL almost 5 years ago at a hackathon in Berlin. This was me during the hackathon, and we actually won the very first prize. But now 5 years later, GraphQL is even more popular than it was back then. So in this video, I will be showing all the reasons why developers love GraphQL so much, including myself. There are many advantages to using GraphQL over REST APIs. For example, you have one single endpoint. So let's have a look at a REST API. This is a free tool called JSON Placeholder, which comes with a great mock API that I often use if I want to quickly mock something up. You can see it has multiple endpoints, such as an endpoint to get posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users. And all the endpoints will have different routes. If you want to get a list of posts, a single post, the comments of a post, you maybe also want to add new post, delete post, add post. There are multiple things you can do with post, and there are multiple routes as well. So only for post, there are already 8 different routes. And this is completely different in GraphQL world. In GraphQL world, everything has one single route. In GraphQL, there's only one route, which is the GraphQL API endpoint. And in here, you can get access to all the different entities that we just saw. So from one single endpoint, you can send queries to get a list of posts, to get a specific post, or to make changes to post. So let's have a look at all the different queries. So these queries will represent all the endpoints that you have for your GraphQL API. The only difference is you don't have to send requests to different endpoints. You just have one single endpoint. You already had a brief glance at the GraphiQL interface, and this is another reason why developers love GraphQL so much. If you would compare it to documentation for a REST API, you might see something like this. REST APIs don't have a built-in way to add documentation, so developers need to write their own documentation. And as you can see here, they just used plain text to document the REST API. You need to click on all the individual things to figure out more about this individual endpoint. You can see an example endpoint, and you can also see a list of all the different endpoints. But developers have to write this by hand. There is no way to auto-generate documentation for REST APIs. Sometimes developers will use OpenAPI or Swagger to document the REST APIs, but typically this is something people forget whenever they start making more and more changes to the REST APIs. If you would go back to the graphical interface, you can already see a huge difference. In GraphQL, you auto-document your GraphQL API just by creating a schema. And without a schema, there is no GraphQL API. In the graphical interface, you can actually explore the schema, and you can find all the different queries, you can find the query parameters, and you can also find response types of all your different queries. This is very different from a REST API, where you actually need to send a request to the API to figure out what its response will look like. Another common problem for REST APIs is underfetching and overfetching. This means that you either don't get enough data or too much data on every request you send to the REST API. So let's have a look at an example. So this REST API has multiple routes. You, for example, can get all the posts that are available. If you send a request to the endpoint to get all the posts, you will also receive all 4 available fields for this post, meaning its user ID, its title, and the body. But maybe you only want to use the ID and the title in your application. This is what we call overfetching. You get too much data as you only need 2 of the 4 available fields. And it doesn't seem like much, but if you're loading 100 posts, loading 200 fields that you're not using might be a lot for your application. Then we also have the example of underfetching, meaning that you don't get enough data whenever you send a request to the REST API. So let's look at the endpoint to get the information of a single post. You can see it returns the fields user ID, title, and body. But what if you also want to show the comments for this post in your UI? With REST, there's nothing else you can do besides sending an additional request to the REST API. So besides having an endpoint to get a single post, you also have an endpoint to get all the comments for this post. So every time you want to combine the information of the post with also the comments for this post, you need to send 2 requests to the REST API. In GraphQL, you can easily solve the problems of underfetching and overfetching. So let's open the GraphiQL again and try a query to get all the available posts right here on our screen. So we can use the getPost query, and then we can define all the fields that we like to see in the response. So we can define the ID in the title, the user ID, and also the body. So this is similar to what the REST API did. It returns all the fields that we request, which are all the available fields for posts. But then in GraphQL, you can also change the fields that are returned. So we can change our query so it only returns the ID in the title. So this is how easily you can fix the overfetching problem in GraphQL and no longer load too much data into your application. Quite similar, GraphQL also solves the underfetching problem where you don't get enough data. So let's try and get a single post in GraphQL by using this query called getPost and define the query parameter to be 1. So this will retrieve the ID in the title for the post with the ID 1. But we can also use the same query to get the comments. So you can just define a field called comments, define the ID and maybe also the message. Or however it's called maybe name. Let's call it name. So this returns a single post, its ID in its title, but also the comments for this post all in one request. So as opposed to REST, you don't have to send 2 different requests. You can do everything just in one single request. And of course, there are many more reasons why developers love GraphQL. So let me know in the comments what you think of GraphQL and why you like building with GraphQL APIs. If you enjoyed this video, also subscribe to my channel, as I will be posting weekly videos about cool things I'm building.